This week I'll be throwing the components of a large lidded jar. This is another pot made for my exhibition at YSP, Yorkshire Sculpture Park, which begins November 4th with all the pots viewable in person and available online too with international shipping. I'll add all the relevant links down below in the video's description. I'm throwing the body of this jar from roughly 3.5 kilograms of stoneware clay, which is 7.7 pounds for any of you imperialists watching. This clay is on the firm side, which you should be able to gather by watching me struggle here with it. The first few folds are always the worst, but once the harder outer layer is mixed with the softer clay inside, the whole lump becomes easier to wedge. This process removes any pockets of air from inside the clay as they're stretched and popped as the clay is spiraled around. And like mentioned before, it also makes the body uniform in texture, so there aren't any hard lumps or soft patches, as these inconsistencies only create issues later on when making the pot on the wheel. So if you don't wedge your clay well enough, you'll actually only make the process more difficult for yourself later on. After the clay has been rhythmically wedged enough, which I usually sense just by feel, or visually by looking for a smooth, even texture covering the mass of clay, it's time to roll the piece of clay up without trapping any air inside it. And this is an exceedingly difficult process to describe, as essentially all I'm doing is very slightly changing my hand positions whilst gradually using less force. I'm also trying to direct the clay into my cupped right hand. This way the clay comes together in a convex surface, one that won't trap air underneath it when it's slammed against the wheelhead. The tail end of the spiral is then gradually incorporated, tiny fold by tiny fold, as not to trap any air beneath it as it's forced into the larger lump. There's still a few lines on the base, but these can be easily smoothed over by hand, like so. Or the whole lump of clay can be rocked on the table like this, which rounds it off and eliminates any crevice that might trap air when the clay is slammed centrally on the wheelhead. Now, centering big bits of clay on the wheel can be a challenge, especially when you're working with material that's relatively firm. The first thing I do is seal the base of clay against the wheel, which I do by pressing a finger into it, like so. And I take any bit of clay that's removed throughout this dry centering process and press it firmly back into the top. I then tightly grab a hold of my wrist to stabilise my knuckle as I run it up and down the lump, removing any high spots or undulations, which over a number of passes makes the mass of clay spin around more evenly. And it just means that when you actually start to centre with water, you should have an easier time. Typically, I prefer throwing with softer clay, but as my pieces tend to have relatively distinct, sharp angles in them, soft clay can at times be a hindrance, as it loses its strength more quickly. I'm definitely not an expert at throwing larger pots, so the process ends up taking a bit longer, especially compared to simple, smaller pots, such as mugs and bowls, which are thrown in mere minutes. So the strength the clay has isn't really that important, as the pots don't really have that much time for the material to start degrading. But with bigger pots like this, which can take anywhere between 12 to 20 minutes to make, I definitely notice a difference in the material after a while. Hence my choice of firm clay for these, even if it does make centering a bit more of a pain. And now begins the process of coning the clay up and down. This is sort of like wedging, but on the wheel, and it helps the platelets that make up the clay body knit together and align, which helps it to be more plastic and in theory easier to throw with. As I'm centering, instead of getting more water from the bucket, I occasionally reach my hands down and scrape the slip off the metal wheelhead and spread it back over the lump of clay, thus lubricating my hands so the clay spinning beneath doesn't stick to them. Throughout the coning process I felt the piece of clay become more centered. It actually feels smoother, and it's at this point that I'll begin pressing it down into a thick disc shape, ready to be opened up and thrown into the body of the jar. I make sure the top of the lump is perfectly flat, and I also just run my finger down the outside, removing any clay that feels as if it's uneven. I use my finger and thumb and press them in firmly right in the centre of the piece of clay. My fingers on the outside are also squeezing in, and as I get deeper, I begin using all the fingertips of my left hand to apply pressure to a larger surface area. As this hollow is opened up, if you notice that it's dry inside, it's helpful to add more slip or water, or even, in this case, I'm using a soaked sponge to essentially replace the role my fingertips were playing on my right hand, whilst simultaneously providing water to this area to keep it spinning freely, as it's often at this stage that beginners, and well, even myself sometimes, introduce an unevenness in the walls, an undulation, as dry hands catch on the spinning wall, causing the pot to jar and oscillate slightly. With the base of the pot now formed, I collar in this thick ring of clay, directing the walls upward into a tapering shape. This also thins out the thick donut of clay I had previously, making the subsequent pulls easier, as there's simply less material I have to manoeuvre between my hands. I then use 2 hands to compress the top. I'm almost squeezing the clay down, all in an attempt to make it revolve without any undulation in the top. And at this point, finally, I can begin pulling up the walls. Instead of using a knuckle for this first pull, I'm using the palm of my hand so that I can apply pressure to a larger surface area. For my next pull, I switch to using a soaked sponge on the outside, as lifting up the walls of bigger pots can take quite a long time. It helps to have a source of water in your palm, which I can squeeze as I pull if I feel like things are getting too dry. The main thing here is to keep your movements consistent. From the moment I initiate the pull, at the base, I move my hands up at an even rate, and I also keep the wheel speed relatively even too. I don't suddenly speed up or slow down, but I do occasionally slow down slightly as I near the top. Between each pull, I collar the shape in, just to keep it from splaying out too much, which is what the clay will naturally want to do as the walls are lifted up higher and higher. My hands, both inside and out, aren't completely level as I pull the clay up. From the inside, my fingers are pushing out to form this bump, and on the outside, my hand is just underneath this, lifting this bulge of clay upwards. With this slightly staggered hand positioning, I'm able to pull the clay up as the thicker walls are squeezed through a gap that gets progressively smaller between your digits on the outside and inside. When my hands reach the top, I let go very gently, as any sudden movements off this spinning piece of clay is usually enough to impart some sort of distortion on it. You can generally be quite rough when you're putting your hands on the pot, as long as it's controlled, but when you release your grip, it has to be done softly. Taking your time is crucial. This lift takes 45 seconds from beginning to end. If I were to pull the walls up very quickly with the wheel spinning at this rate, then it may very well gain some height, but I'd also leave quite dramatic throwing rings in the walls, which would make each subsequent lift much harder, as it means I have to navigate these undulating waves in the wall. Whereas if you lift the walls up slowly, the throwing rings in the surface become very closely knitted together, to the point where the walls are almost perfectly straight, which means when I do the following pull, I'm not having to contend with an undulating surface. And I release my grip softly. The cylinder is collared in again, beginning at the bottom and gradually working my hands up. With this next pull, I create the very beginning of the angular shape I want by narrowing the base slightly, giving it a slight belly, which is where the most angular point of the pot will be. And then I come in towards the top. It's only subtle, but the base shape of the pot I want to make is there. And the shaping itself is something I do very gradually, just like centering the clay or pulling up the walls. If I attempt to do it all in one go, I'm probably going to fail. To make the jar belly out, I'm applying more pressure from the inside, pushing out, and the sponge and my fingers on the outside are really just guiding it, as well as bracing the wall and preventing me from pushing out too much. At this point, I'm now throwing up, so the pressure is equal from both the inside and out. And then as I get towards the neck of the pot, this changes again, and I'm now pushing more from the outside. There also comes a point where I can hook the thumb of my left hand over the rim to make contact with my right hand, which helps to stabilize both as they move. There are other things too I do to stabilize myself as I work, such as keep my right elbow tucked into my torso, which I'm also leaning my upper body weight onto. As for my left arm, it is sort of just hanging there in space, But it isn't held there limply, rather it's kept tense and active, but keeping it upright like this as you work, whilst keeping the arms strong and stable, can be quite a difficult thing to do when you're learning, as you have to position your arms in certain ways and move them very accurately together in ways you may very well have not done before. And that's much of learning how to throw pottery. Everything feels awkward and clumsy at the start, and you probably destroy more pots than are successful. But eventually, with enough practice and determination, these awkward, clumsy movements begin to feel ordinary. There is a very subtle undulation in the rim, so, using a sharp potter's needle, I just slice it away. And with the rough shape of the pot now thrown, the outside shape can be tidied up, which begins by removing some of the excess clay from around the base. I use a very ancient, very worn turning tool to do this, and these dryer scraps aren't thrown into the reclaim bucket, instead they're wedged back into the clay from the bag immediately. The next step is to neaten up the outside surface, which I do by scraping away the slip that covers the pot. And like I mention every time when showing this, it's not really pushing the metal into the clay, rather I push the stoneware out against the metal edge. This way the tool is less likely to catch, which happens easily if you dig metal into a spinning pot too firmly. I use a heat gun on the scraped clean portion of the most angular part of the body, as otherwise when I scrape clean the slip of this portion, the sharpest point of the angle here might continue to bulge outwards. So by drying it quickly, I just stiffen up the form, potentially preventing it from distorting as I continue refining the pot. Throughout this process, I've left the rim relatively thick, as I want there to be enough material in it for me to alter in a moment when I create the inset gallery the lid will sit on. To create the inset rim, I squeeze some slip over the top, and I use slip because it clings to the walls, whereas water would just flow down the walls I just carefully finished. I then grip the rim with my left hand and then push it in with the tip of my index finger. My left hand supports this overhang from underneath and generally just braces it from all sides. I even use my nail to create an almost right angle here. And with that done, I can just scrape away the slip accumulated from this process. I use a plastic tool for this small indentation, as it's smoother and is less likely to catch on such a delicate part of the pot. I then measure the opening with a pair of stiff calipers. These are Taranti's cast aluminium calipers, and they've served me well for the past 10 years or so, remaining incredibly tight for the entire time. Now, as I'm going to be lifting this jar off the wheel without any bats or anything, I give it all a quick blast whilst refining the shape further with a much sharper metal kidney. I then slide a wire underneath it, keeping it taut the entire time, and then with 2 dry hands I lift it away. The next thing to make is the lid, and this is altogether a much faster, much easier process, and one for which I can use very soft clay as there's virtually no height in these. But first, I reverse the calipers. This way I can throw the locating flange on the lid so that it fits perfectly into the jar. But with that being said, I do always give myself a millimetre or 2 extra, just as I'd rather have a safety net, a bit of extra material to work with, which I can easily trim away to make it fit just right. For these lids, I centre the clay and then flatten it out, and at this stage it's about 4 centimetres thick. I then make an opening in the middle that's not very deep, and then I open it up, leaving quite a thick expansive clay around the outside. I then separate this outer portion of clay into 2 parts. I do this by pushing some of it in, just like I did for the rim of the jar. The small protruding vertical wall is the portion that slots inside the jar, whereas the horizontal plane will sit on top of the jar's rim. And once again, for this part, I'm throwing it to be slightly thicker than what I ultimately need. This way I can refine it at the trimming stage and get it exactly to my liking. Whereas if I were to throw this very thin and fine at this stage to the exact shape I want, then there's a chance that, as it dries out, it could change and distort, and then I haven't got any material left in it to trim in order to fix it. It's for this reason that you typically see lids thrown on the slightly heavy side, to then be refined once leather hard. Once the shape is there, I can press the internal floor of the lid with my very bendy thumbs. And then, just like the jar itself, I proceed to scrape all the slip off it. This way the thrown piece will dry out more quickly, and it's generally just good practice to do this with any thrown pot you make. I then scrape clean the outside edge, as this area needs to be relatively dry in order for me to pick it up easily. Although I'll be the first to admit it, I should have thrown this lid on a bat. I make sure the locating flange is tapering. This way, when you position the lid on the jar, it slots in really easily before being guided in place perfectly by that taper. I then measure it one last time to make sure it's the right size, and then a wire can be slid underneath it before I struggle to lift it away. With the 2 parts thrown, that's it for this week. You'll have to tune in next Sunday to see how I trim the jar, making the 2 components fit together. Thanks so much for taking your time to watch, and I'll see you again next week.